get you started about why we want to take a class on education in the first place, you're going to come across a lot of motions about should schools do this or that? Like, should schools make students separate students into classes based on how smart they are or based on how old they are? You're going to get motions about whether um, centers like Fiji should be banned or not. Gonna get motions about whether a history class should be focusing on the present, like whatever is happening, the recent past or the far away past, right? So all of these motions basically center around one central theme, and that theme is education. Let me just share my screen real quick.
Yep, you are right.
Hi. So can you all see it?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right. So let's talk about education. Who are the stakeholders when it comes to any motion about education? Well, obviously, the main stakeholder are the students, right? They're the ones who are going to be most directly affected by anything that happens in a school or in a college. It shapes their entire life because they probably spend most of their day there and most of their early life, most of their formative years where they form their opinions, they form their understanding of the world, they learn how to interact with society. All of this happens within within the education system. But that's not all. They also pay to get educated, which means if you think of education like a service where you have a consumer and you have a provider, students are the consumer, right? They're the ones paying to receive the service. All right. Who is this next stakeholder? We have schools and colleges. These are the people who provide the service, right? And while most of us think of schools and colleges as places where we develop, places where we grow, you can also think of these as the providers of the service, like just like a TV cable service provider or like Amul milk, right? These are people who create a product that people want to produce, people want to consume. This means that these schools, they care about their reputation because they need a good reputation to be able to attract smart students to study there. They need to attract these are basically their customer base, right? Students. They care about their employees, who are the teachers, because they care about whether they care about the outcomes that they're getting out of school. Are their students performing well in many spheres? Is their school getting a good name? Are they being recognized well? Are they getting enough profits, perhaps also, if you're a private school? Then we have government and society, right? So let's understand a little bit more how this affects government or society. It's not a direct effect. It's something more indirect. Often society wants certain outcomes from the education system, or and any outcome of the education system, that is how students, what these students end up doing later in their life, is going to indirectly impact society. And similarly, the government also wants certain outcomes from an education system, right? It wants certain literacy rates. It wants enough individuals who are educated who go into the job market and are able to produce value for the economy. It wants people who can shape society. And finally, we have the taxpayers and the donors. Now, the taxpayers matter in any public education institution, right? Because it's their money that's going into setting up these institutions and running them. Now, and in a private institution, you probably have a large number of donors who give their money for the institution to run. Now, typically, the donors have a say in how their money is used. Now, obviously, private donors will have a greater say than the public as a whole, because private donor is someone who's making a single large contribution. They can speak with a united voice, unlike the public who might have different things that they want out of the education system. And there's no one single person who's making such a large contribution to say, this is exactly what I want to happen in the school. Whereas a private donor can easily say, I want you to use my money to set up a football court or set up a science lab or set up a small museum on the school. And whereas the public usually demands more broad things like we want equal access, we want our education system to generate make it easy for people to find employment and so on. All right,
A question.
let's move on to, now that you know who the stakeholders are,
I have a question.
move on. All right, go ahead.
You said that children also pay the money, but really children don't pay the money as the parents. So parents should also be added as a stakeholder, right?
Yeah, sure. You can think of parents as a stakeholder. But in terms of who actually receives the service, it's the children, right? So parents are more part of the broad society kind of stakeholder that they want certain broad outcomes. But sure, yeah. All right, what are the objectives of education systems? Now, this is going to differ a little bit between schools and colleges because of the age group they're catering to. Schools primarily want students to learn, right? This is obvious, you all know it. You go to school to receive, to learn different subjects and come back. But there's a lot more that schools are meant to do. Schools are supposed to ensure social development. What does this look like? It looks like making friends. It looks like learning how to work in a team. It's also about how you express your emotions to people around you, right? All of this social development is something you pick up at a young age in school because that's where you interact with the most number of people. Sure, your parents might teach you some things, but interacting with society on a large scale, interacting with different kinds of people, people who come from different backgrounds than you, all of that happens in a school. And note that all of this is not something that teachers try to do usually, right? It's just something that you generally interact with people around you. So it's not completely a regulated, this is how you need to interact with people kind of teaching that's done. It's more something you figure out for yourself in the process of while you pass through the education system. The other thing they're meant to do is value systems. Like they're supposed to teach you these value systems, right? Again, your parents perhaps teach you a large part of your value system, but there are some specific things you often end up learning from schools as well. Things like don't cheat on your test or don't lie about whether you did your homework or not, right? These are enforced in schools through punishment, through awarding students who show good behavior, right? And also some schools like, for example, a religious school will probably have a high emphasis on moral education and classes related to that, right? So value systems is something that are often pushed through and developed in school. Now, it's not just value systems, it's also, schools also have the ability to affect your opinion on things by what the teachers say to you, by the kind of topics that are taught to you in school, right? For example, there was a recent controversy about the government removing large parts of Mughal history from Indian textbooks, saying that it doesn't cover, saying that it's a very narrow view of Indian history and it doesn't cover the rest of it, right? So through the specific things that are taught to you in school can shape your view of the world around you, right? For example, if Mughal history was to be removed from textbooks, you would not know a large amount about the contribution of Mughals to how India has been shaped today. On the other hand, if in place of Mughal history, if you were taught about, say, the history of your particular state, you would learn a lot more about what makes your state unique and what is the value and the heritage that your state has. So the choice of what you learn in school is going to shape your opinions. Finally, schools also need to keep you engaged, right? Now, to people, to most of you, this might sound like, oh, I need to pay attention in school, but it's about a lot more than that. Schools need to make people feel like there is value in their children staying in school. They need to make sure that those children feel like school is valuable for them, because otherwise those children would be out on the streets. they need to make sure that children are not engaging in child labor or roaming the streets or in a gang, right? And the way and the alternative to doing all these things is staying in school, which is why the emphasis to make sure that students don't drop out of learning is very important, especially in areas that have large amounts of crime or have large amounts of poverty, which is when it's most important for these children to stay in school. And an easy way to incentivize this is often things like providing free education or free meals to ensure that they actually turn up to school every day. Now, these are the primary objectives of the education system. And in any emotion you have about education, you can always think about whether these incentives are being fulfilled and think about which of these incentives are more important to fulfill, depending on the specific type of motion or depending on which stakeholder you're talking about. Let's think about the objectives of a college education system next. Now, again, learning is obviously important here. But there are other things that they care about, right? They care about people finding their passion. That is finding out what most interests them and what they want to end up doing for the rest of their life. Now, the way they can ensure this is giving you flexibility in choosing your courses, giving you a large number of facilities to be able to explore different things and find what is the best fit for you. But note that finding your passion is only important is only important to the extent that at the end of it you can also gain a job, because that is that's the other objective of a college, which is making sure people can get ready for a job. And the reason that most people go to college, well, the reason the average person goes to college is so that they can find a job and not just so that they can find a passion, right? Often a passion to people who come from lower income groups is secondary to having a job, which gives them financial stability. How do colleges make you ready for a job? Again, this might seem obvious that they give you the necessary skills, they give you the necessary knowledge, but there's a little more that they do. They also try to maintain a reputation and be able to attract companies based on that reputation. And another thing you need to know here is that there is an increasing trend of people of society believing that a degree is required for a job, and not just and this is because of two things. One is the increasing competition, right? There are a lot more people trying to get high paying jobs than there are those high paying jobs, which means the more qualifications you seem to have for the job, the better you are. So this competition is driving a push for further education. But the other thing doing this is the sectoral employment shift, right? That most people are not engaged in traditional occupations like agriculture or carpentry, where the knowledge is passed down from parent to child or passed down through things like just an apprenticeship. They're engaged in often tertiary sector jobs where like being a doctor or an engineer or a social scientist. And all of those jobs need very specific formal education that's required. So this is also driving a push towards people spending more time within the education system. Now, finally, colleges, whether they want to do this or not, also need to make students ready to shape society, right? These are people who are going to go out and vote. These are people who are going to go out and create policies in the next few years that will affect the entirety of society. These are people who are going to decide what their work culture is going to be like and what are the kind of jobs they'll take and what they will do within those jobs that affect society. And some of the ways that this ends up happening in a college, some of the ways students express this in a college is often through things like protests or political activity, which colleges don't always like, but it's something that it's something that is technically covered under your freedom of expression. The other way that you can do this is probably student leadership within a college. You have students leading various organizations, you have students leading various bodies and gaining leadership experience, which they can use further when they go out into society. So these are the objectives that you need to think about when you think about a college-specific call it specific motion because this is what is most required for people who are in that age group in the education system. Okay, let's move on to the learning environment, which is, like we said, learning and teaching is probably one of the most important objectives of what happens in the education system. So people who primarily affect your learning environment are probably the teachers, right? Because they're the ones they're the ones you interact with on an everyday level. Teachers can connect with the students in very specific ways. This will decide whether they're able to identify and reach out to slow or weak learners, because only when they're able to do this are they able to ensure that these students find out what problems these students might have and be able to provide be able to provide better methods of teaching or better alternatives for these students to be able to learn. Teachers need to be able to show empathy and find out about problems students might have at home, to find out about their mental health, to find out are they being bullied, right? All of these are things that might reduce your ability to learn. All of these are things that might be able to reduce your ability to learn. And teachers need to be able to identify and stop this. But also the other way teachers affect you is probably their mode of learning, right? They can be in it, they can try and make the content interesting, they can try and be very interactive. But mode of teaching is not something that's just about teachers, it's also about the school, right? Does it have the facilities, or does it have the money to be able to provide facilities like a field trip to a history museum, or like science labs or projectors to show you videos? So it's quite common that schools that cater to higher income groups are able to provide better facilities and hence a better mode of teaching and a better learning experience for students. So, and that's something you need to keep in mind. So when we talk about teachers and the mode of teaching, just remember that it's not restricted just to how a teacher is, but also to the kind of facilities that you can afford. And naturally, if you can afford better facilities, you can probably afford to pay your teachers more and incentivize them to teach better or be able to hire the better teachers. Right. The next thing is your interest level. And it's kind of obvious. Only if you're interested, only if you want to pay attention in the first place in what's being taught, are you going to learn anything, right? This comes before anything. But whether or not you pay interest is often determined not just by is the subject interesting, but are you good at the subject? Because that's how children think, right? They want to pay interest, they want to pay attention if they think they're good at something and they can get something out of it. Children can like in lower income areas, again, children often drop out of school because they don't see themselves getting good outcomes from that education system. They don't see themselves going to university or making use of this education, right? And this also comes from whether or not you're doing well in your class, because if you're constantly getting bad grades, it doesn't feel like a good learning environment to you, unless someone, probably the teacher or your parents, is motivating you and saying that and encouraging you to learn. So paying attention to your interest level is something that's very, very important for teachers to do. Now, finally, your peer group is also going to affect your learning environment, right? The first way it does this is crowd behavior. So if half of your class is not listening to a teacher who is not really strict or not really able to control the class, everybody else starts following that, right? Or it could be crowd behavior in the sense that in a coaching institute, people are often pushed to study because everybody around them is studying and doing well. So you want to keep up with the crowd. But also the peer group affects you in the sense that you need to feel comfortable in the learning environment, right? You need to feel like you have some friends around. You need to feel like the class is kind to you. You need to feel like, and people who are, say, being bullied or people who are socially awkward and find it harder to make friends are not getting the best, most comfortable environment that they can get for learning. And this probably affects what they're able to learn. So I'll just give you a moment to digest all of that. Now, while these are the most important things that affect your learning environment, again, depending on the specific motion, there could be other things as well. Okay, let's move on to a slightly more specific topic, which is universities and a couple of niche things that might come up in motions about universities. One thing you should know is how professors are chosen in universities. Universities, unlike schools, don't just want their professors to teach. Especially the higher end universities, the big names, they also want their professors to lead research groups, right? To mentor graduate students. Now, when we think of universities as a place of learning, we often think of undergraduate students who go to courses who do things similar to school. But universities also cater to graduate students who spend most of their time doing things like research or fieldwork, right? So professors are often picked in universities to be able to mentor these kind of students, which means the universities care about their research experience and their ability to contribute to research specifically more than they care about teaching. Why is this? You might think that, oh, the undergraduate students are probably important, they're probably larger in number, and their education is important. Let's see why this works out for universities. Well, firstly, these professors probably bring in the money for the university, right? Because the grants that come in, the donations that come in, are all based on whether the university has a great reputation for producing the leaders of the field, right? So when you have the best, when you can attract good researchers, when you can produce good research, patents, products, or leaders, that's when you get these donations. So that's why universities typically focus on research experience when picking professors. Now, while students learning through courses is really important, at the college level, you probably have the mental maturity to be able to learn by yourself as well. You have alternate resources like your peers who can explain things that you don't understand. You learn by yourself. You have projects and internships and other mechanisms of learning, which is why universities don't prioritize teaching the same way that schools prioritize teaching. So it's often a balance between things. But of course, they need to have mechanisms to incentivize good teaching, right? So what they do is they take student feedback on who's a good teacher and who's a bad teacher. They provide incentives for teachers like awards that you get based on your learning, or grants that you get awards that you get based on how good your teaching is, or specific, salary boosts if you get a certain type of feedback. So while we've talked a lot about how research is the primary focus in universities that have a large number of graduate students, or in universities that are at the top of their field, you need to remember that this is not all universities either, right? You have a lot of the lower end universities who cater who probably focus more on the teaching aspect, because their aim is just to send students out to do a job, right? Their aim is not to produce research. They probably might not have graduate students, or they're not able to attract the top research talent, which means they are focused primarily on teaching. So you need to remember that this distinction does exist. And of course, there are universities that focus on different set of subjects, right? Like vocational education, who again don't care about research. They just care about being able to provide employable skills to their students. So remember, this distinction exists. All right. Before we move on to the practice motions, do we have any questions about, well, any of these topics?
So there are some professors who prefer teaching rather than doing research. Also, there are some universities that prefer doing research over doing teaching rather than research, right?
Right. Yeah. So there are some universities that hire professors specifically just for teaching, and there of course are universities that are catering to that are if you're not a top university, you often have a greater focus on teaching because either you don't have the resources to be able to enable research, or you're not able to attract the top research talent, or the consumer base, the students that you are catering to, care a lot more about getting a job quickly and care a lot about learning than they care about the reputation of the university in terms of research. So yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Does anyone else have questions? Okay, so let's move on to some practice motions. So I'm going to give you maybe a couple of minutes to think about this yourself. And then I would like you guys to maybe to raise your hands when you have ideas about the motion. Okay. So the first motion we have is this house would split students into classes based on their academic strength or how well they're doing in school, how well they're doing in their subjects, rather than age, which is how we split people into classes right now, right? If you're a certain age, you go into a certain class. So I'll give you a couple of minutes to think about it and raise your hands when you're ready. You can have ideas for government or opposition. That's okay.
I have an argument on opposition.
Yeah, just raise your hand for now. We'll give everybody some time to think about it. All right, let's start. Ira, you said you had something for opposition.
Yeah. For opposition, it reduces motivation, and there become like a child feels a sense of inequality that hey, these people are getting like they are going in another class because obviously people realize who is smart and who is not smart, but the inequality of people getting separated into classes is just not right for the child's mental peace and everything.
Right.
Can like stop not achieve like demoralize themselves and everything.
Okay. All right. Um. Uh. Who's next? Yeah, Preksha.
I had some points in government, but mostly in opposition. Can I do both?
Yeah, sure.
So in the government side, we can talk about effective learning because now it's the students' abilities on which they're based, like into putting them into classes, and so it's more of a concept of equity rather than equality. So like it's not their age
Right.
restricting them to learn anymore; it's their development of the brain and their capacity to like grasp concepts easily. So since there's less restrictions on them, we've often seen like children who are like more intelligent, they can easily get bored in classes if they already understand the concept and the teacher is like going at a slower pace to make the other students understand. So this causes less boredom in the student and faster and more effective learning. And also if a student is getting bored in class, there's a higher tendency of them to distract other students, and these distractions are also reduced if they're split according to their academic strength, because all of the students in the class will be on the same level of grasping, and that way there can be like in classes with a higher level of grasping, there can be more intellectual discussions, and hence all of those students can like benefit better with them. Whereas on the other side, like students with a weaker capacity to learn, the teachers can go at a slower pace with them. And since it's a this house would motion, we can easily just make a policy which says that we can like have a basis of testing the academic strength, so that there's no like illogical way of matching students up in one class which can be ineffective. So we could like make a policy according to that. In opposition, we can say that it would cause like overburdening in the child, because obviously there's a difference, like a different range of brain development that happens. Like at a younger age, there's more brain development, and as you grow older, there's lesser brain development. So because of that, this child can be overburdened with a lot of knowledge coming in at once, which according to the current system is like much easier because you give them knowledge step by step, because that's like the uniform and universal way of learning. So that possibility is there, and then there's a higher chance of bullying and jealousy among children since they're of different ages, and there'll be like no uniform level of comparison because somebody is older, somebody is younger, so the student can't like think that, oh, this person's doing much better than me, and that can cause more jealousy because they won't understand that there's a higher chance that they are getting some concept better because they're older. Also that can like cause a lot of difficulty for the teacher to be able to teach these students, because like younger students can relate to different aspects of life, and like if a teacher is trying to teach something to get them to relate those things to the students, then younger students will be able to relate to different things and older students would relate to different things. So that would make it harder for the teacher to make those students understand those concepts. And then there's a
All
wider
right.
range of
Okay.
attention span. Younger students will have a shorter attention
All
span.
right. All right. Let's give someone else
So
a
like
chance now.
that makes it harder to teach as well.
Yeah. Sanket?
Yes, ma'am. I feel as opposition students should not be split into classes based on their academic strength, as the mutual respect for each other, not because of their IQ, not because of their academic skill, that will be
Right.
lost. And as an individual, as we grow up, as we go into the world, we don't need people who have the same intellectual ability or the academic skill as us. So we should be able to learn and know how to interact, how to form our relationships with such people.
Right. Yeah, that's great. Who's next? Yeah. Adrian?
I think for proposition, we can mention that there will be more the society will be more inclusive, because the status quo is likely to be discrimination against age. If you're younger, then it means that you have less experience. Then there's a hierarchy. On our side, when there's a mix of age in class, it means that there's less. It's more likely that there's less such hierarchy. There's more inclusion, where the metric to success is more based on it's more based on your ability rather than other like uncontrollable factors like your age. So it'll be more fair and more inclusive. For opposition, the point to make is about like preparedness, like mental preparedness or whatever, like mainly mental preparedness. Typically on how children deal in classroom, because classroom is not only about knowledge, it's also about how you associate with people. When you learn a lot but you're not able to associate with people a lot, you are basically lagging behind when it comes to communicating with people. Unless like when you associate with people with the same age, maybe like the comparative like this. On one side, whereas classes are based on age, then people might learn through communication by speaking with people who have similar mental ability. But on their side, people who are super smart, who study with people who are way older, then it's harder to gain this impact because people who are older probably want to talk, or there's just maturity.
All right, great. You guys had really good arguments. So I'm just going to try and group all of these arguments and well, present them to you again. Right? So let me just quickly get rid of these. Yep. Okay. So, well, probably the most basic argument on both sides is going to be about learning. Let's talk about government first, right? The idea here was, I think, that you guys gave me was each student learns at the pace that is correct for them. Now, you can explain this by saying that so the way that you guys explained this was that students who are smart need something, students who are weak need something. So the first thing you might want to identify here is that generally people teach for the average of the class, right? Which means that this motion only really affects people right at the top and right at the bottom of the class. It's something that government wants to identify to begin with. So how does it affect these people specifically, right? And note that usually we care a bit more about the people at the bottom than we care about the people at the top. Because if you're smart, you probably have the ability to use other resources to learn by yourself whatever you're interested in. You're probably going to succeed in your life anyways. But if you're weaker, if you're slower at learning, that schools really, really care about what's happening to you, right? So you need to frame your argument about, well, while you should probably explain why it's good for people at the top, you should also really explain why people who are weaker are getting good outcomes from this. And what you might want to do here is, what you might want to do here is a couple of things. Now, and this is where we go into the learning environment, the things we were talking about there, and see which of these things you can achieve for students on government side. So one thing you could do is probably the teaching mode, right? So if you learn a little slower, then perhaps the teachers will teach you fewer concepts maybe, but make sure that you understand all of them really well. They will use methods, more interactive methods. They will not give you harsh assignments and instead be there every step of the way of your learning to be able to make sure that you learn. So teaching mode is one thing. The second thing that affects your learning environment, which we talked about, is your interest level or how you feel about the class, right? So on government side, when everyone around you is probably at the same level as you, it's not that most of the class is just doing so much better than you at every test and you feel bad, which is what is going to happen on opposition. That doesn't happen on government, right? So you feel like you are not at the bottom of the pack, that you really have a chance to do well in this class. And this probably affects your motivation to learn in the first place. But also, finally, you're interested in whatever you're learning because it's going at the pace where you can understand it. So you want to pay attention because it's making sense to you now, right? So when you're talking about learning, you need to talk about how specifically this learning gets better, right? You need to talk about these different factors of learning, of the learning environment that affect you that affect you based on this motion. So it's not enough to just broadly classify things. You need to talk about which stakeholders, which types of students specifically are affected. And then you need to give analysis on different ways that learning improves based on this. Okay. So another argument you could make on government is about keeping students engaged. Now, why does this matter? And again, this probably matters more for the students who are at the bottom, right? And who are the students who are likely to be at the bottom in the first place? Maybe it's somebody who doesn't have the time when they go back home to study because they have to take care of their little sibling because their parents are working. Maybe it's somebody who's been facing some mental health issues, right? Maybe it's somebody who's being continuously bullied in their class and they don't because because they're a little bit different, or because they learn slowly, or because they have a learning disability, right? These are the students who are most likely to feel like, you know what, I'm doing terribly at school anyways. I'm not going to get like a good job or a good degree out of this. Why am I even going to school, right? These are the students who it's most important to keep engaged. These are students you don't want to drop out of school. So keeping these students engaged probably comes a lot better when they don't feel this way about themselves, when they don't feel like they're at the bottom of the class. And and maybe this ties a little bit into some analysis we gave on the learning argument, but you can explain it and impact it very differently, right? The impact is obviously that these people don't drop out of school, and explaining, like I just did, why it's important for these particular students to stay in school, because if they drop out, they're never going to be able to find their way up in terms of income levels and better qualities of life. So keeping you engaged is based on how you feel about the class in general and how you feel about your performance in the class specifically. Right. Now, does anyone have questions about government?
No.
All right. Let's talk about opposition. Now, again, learning is going to be a major focus. So you need to think about, let's think about the different parts of the learning environment that affect you on opposition. So you can again say on opposition that, you know what, most children are actually fine with the learning pace because it's suited to the average student, which means that if you're a bad performing student, there are things like remedial classes for you. There are things like extra classes. There's things like teachers specifically sitting with you and helping you out. There's no need to section you into a separate class based on this, right? So you can provide an alternative for these students that already that can exist without doing this extent of separation between students. And what you're doing here is you're pointing out that most students are all actually not affected by the argument that government is giving. So you're trying to weigh the number of students that are getting affected by something. And the other thing you can do is say that the students who are at the bottom are actually affected, actually feel worse with this policy than with status quo. Right? What does this mean? It means that when your school is telling you that you are not fit for the class that most of the people of your age group are at, that you need to be in a lower class because that's how much you can understand, you probably feel terrible about yourself. You feel like you're not good enough. You feel like you're not smart. And for children, because their education system, and often because the education system places such a high value on learning and academic ability specifically, if you feel like you are not good enough academically, you feel like you're just not good enough of a person often, right? It's easy for children to think these things because they're young, right? They get affected by things in very strong ways, right? And if you feel so bad about yourself, there's two things that happen. One, obviously your self-esteem is taking a hit, but also two, your incentive to learn is taking a hit. If you're already two steps back, if you're already low, worse than most people of your age group, why do you need to learn? You're never going to be able to catch up with them, right? That's the feeling you're going to have. But also realistically, you can see on a large scale that any student who starts out not any student who starts out at the lower end of their class, of their age group, sorry, is never going to be able to catch up because they're going to be in this constant cycle of being at the lower end of their age group all the time. So if for some reason, because you were especially if you were in the lower rungs of lower income levels and you didn't have that, if the system exists, probably parents who have the ability to do so will push their kids to be able to learn more so that they can go into the higher grades, right? They will give them extra classes, they will spend time with them, making sure that they understand more things so they can push them into the higher class. But students in the lower class will not have this opportunity, will not have this ability to do it, which means they'll probably get constantly stuck at the lower ends, in the lower classes, and not able to progress, not able to keep up with the rest of their peers, right? And this is something you probably want to avoid, where you are forcing students who are already at a disadvantage to continue at a disadvantage. So you could say as opposition that ensuring students of the same age stay in the same class no matter what their academic ability is actually a great leveler between different students, between different income classes and different abilities. So you can notice that here both government and opposition are talking about the same thing, right? About the teaching mode or talking about how you feel about a certain thing, but they're giving different analysis between these things. So it's so what I want you to note from this is that when we talk about the different factors of a learning environment, you should be able to identify that some of these factors exist on both sides, and who wins the debate about that factor is probably just who is able to explain it better. Which is why I went into such detail about the explanation that you could give about how you feel on government versus opposition. All right, now we can just quickly look at the last argument that I put down here on opposition, but I think you guys explained it really well already, that you interact with people of your age and it's easier to understand. You're probably going through similar things, right? You're at a similar phase of your life. You have a similar mental and emotional maturity, which means it's much easier to make friends with people in your age. But also, if the focus of the education system is not just doing really well academically and going to the higher class and the higher class, that's when you really care about these interactions. You care a lot more about making friends. And that is also a focus of your learning, of your education experience, right? All right, so let's, are you guys ready for one more motion?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, let's go. So this house believes that disruptive student protests should be banned on college campuses. And by disruptive, I mean the meaning of disruptive here is like a protest where you go where you stop classes from continuing, or where you prevent an event like the graduation, or like some speaker coming to speak from happening. All of these are considered as a disruptive to student life. So yeah, I'll give you a couple of minutes to think about the motion. And again, raise your hands whenever you have ideas. And this is specific to college, not school campuses. Okay, I don't see any raised hands yet, so I'm going to give you a minute more. And maybe I'll give you some context about this motion, right? Recently, there have been a lot of protests in universities, especially in the US and Europe, about especially in the US, about the war between Israel and Palestine, where you have students who are protesting for both sides, who are doing things like preventing the graduation ceremony from happening, or who are camping out in the middle of the middle of the road and not letting people walk past, who are raising slogans and disrupting their classes. So this is an issue that's become bigger if you've been following recent news. All right, Adrian, would you like to start?
Oh, sure. So I think for government can say that why it's not justified to have disruptive student protests when you're basically you're talking about those victims or talking about those who are being harmed, and probably you're now further harming them when you're not so sure about how they feel like, and especially in those protests, maybe you're now reinforcing different stereotypes onto those students due to backlash.
All right.
And then for opposition, we can probably mention about the right to expression, and then how disruptive student protests, although it's disruptive, it doesn't mean that it's violence, right?
Right.
Secondly, we can also say that the context for the second argument is that usually these protests are initiated by the student association or the union, right? Which means the student union as a smaller version of the government in school should also do have a democratic system, which means we also have to allow students to to have those democratic rights like protesting, to voice out their opinion, to be better represented. Yeah.
All right. Okay. So just before we go on, just a quick note. You while the idea for democratic system and right to expression is great, the student union is not the one who allows or disallows the protest. It's more the college administration that does this. So we can't really make an argument about why the student union should have a democratic voice. But your initial idea about the right to expression, that stands. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so Sankeet,
Yes, ma'am. I feel it should be banned because there are certain students who actually who organize these protests, and I feel it affects the other students who actually want to come to study. And as a result, if it is really serious, these these protests, then it could be on the news, and these students could be affected, maybe embarrassed, or if it becomes really very serious, the police could be involved, the college could be shut down, and it could affect the natural learning process of the other students. So I feel it should be banned.
okay. Does anyone have any other ideas, or do you want to explain these arguments more or give rebuttals to them?
I got a idea for opposition
Sure.
about how it is a form of self-defense when you voice out your opinion about these possible matters that might happen or might be reflected in our campus or in our nation, why we should be able to
Right.
voice out even when there's other principle but even when it means that some minorities might be harmed, or some people who want to learn better or focus on the campus learning, why these does not matter when it comes to the weighing of self-defense.
All right. Ira?
As the college or school is teaching you on opposition side, if it's teaching you to stand up for yourself, be confident in everything, you should have you should have voice, and just stand up for whatever you think is right, and go ahead with that protest. And you should, if you want to make it, get it to the public notice or the college notice.
All right. Okay, let's think of, let's go into these further, right? Let's build your own arguments actually before. So the first thing we got on government is that you're not sure of the reality and maybe you're reinforcing stereotypes. Now, while the idea behind this is great, where you can explain that maybe many people are not getting complete information, maybe they're just going along with what their friends are saying. The trouble with this argument is probably if you have students protesting about something, these are students who care a lot about things, right? These are students who are finding out information these are students who are actively finding out information about the world and then trying to have conversations on this opinion, trying to have protests on this opinion, which means that they probably you're probably educating more students by allowing protests than you are reinforcing stereotypes, right? You're encouraging students to go out and find out the reality of the world. So I don't think this argument is going to be able to work exactly as you presented it. But the second argument, let's see, was about affecting other students who just want to learn. This is a great argument because you can explain that you can explain that these protests actually disrupt college life, right? Disrupt in the sense that they prevent classes from happening, which means some students aren't able to learn. These protests disrupt something like a graduation. They make big headlines in the newspapers, and this affects the reputation of the college, which means if the reputation is affected, it also affects the job prospects of the people who are graduating, right? So a large number of students who come to the college are there because they want to learn. These students are paying the college to learn, which means that the college has an obligation to them to protect a safe learning environment and a conducive learning environment, right? So we go back into what the objective of the college system is and who is really the person that the college is meant to serve, right? So the majority of students who want to learn. So you can think about it through that framework. The other idea we had here is the potential for violence, right? Now, maybe violence is not often going to happen, especially on a college campus, because you have because they're usually places where you have a greater level where as the administration can literally separate students who are protesting, where you have high consequences like getting expelled, and where most students are simply just trying to make their voice heard and not jump into violence. So you can explain that there's a potential for violence, but the more the easier, say, the more likely outcome you can go for is probably the potential for a lot of discord and anger between different student communities on campus, right? For example, if there's a protest happening about the CAA, right? The act that the government was the Citizenship Amendment Act the government was trying to pass, where they said that refugees from neighboring countries would be allowed would be given immediate citizenship if they were Hindu refugees, right? So when protests happen about something like an issue that is very sensitive to people like religion, you can often have a lot of anger between the different religious groups on campus, right? You can have people, people might be protesting based on what they think is right and wrong, but this could really be an important part of your identity, right? Like this could be an important part of your religion, can be an important part of your identity. And if you have people protesting about this, if you have people saying things about this which hurt you, you might feel unsafe in that campus. You might feel angry at the people who are saying these things to you. You might just not want to interact with them at all. So you're creating an environment where the college campus is becoming politicized and is becoming either unsafe or becoming or causing hatred between different student communities. So this might be a more reasonable and more likely argument you might want to make than just violence if you're on government. But the ideas you're starting with are good. Just think about what is the more likely outcome that you can push from that idea, and think about how you're going to explain that idea. Okay, let's.
I got a question.
Yeah, sure.
Sorry, I didn't catch what you. The reason why the first one is not fine. Can you please explain again? Thank you.
Yes, of course. So, when you have students protesting, when you have students, you basically have them actively finding out about the world, actively trying to get information to be able to form their opinions, which means that which means that you are probably getting them to interact with society a lot more, to care about what's happening in the outside world a lot more. Whereas otherwise, if there are no protests allowed on campus, they probably wouldn't be paying attention to the world outside. They just be wrapped up with whatever is happening in their little bubble, in their little happy bubble of college life, right? But also, secondly, that when people go out and protest in large numbers, when they're taking when they're taking an active effort to do something, they probably are going to find out enough information before they take such a step, right? maybe you'll write a Twitter post without really finding out the right information. But if you're going to skip classes, if you're going to risk getting suspended by the college, and if you're going to go out and join a protest, you're probably going to find out a little bit more about the reality of the situation than you would with you're probably going to find out more about the reality of the situation. So while not sure of the reality, that part of your argument might not be so strong, but reinforcing stereotypes is something you can talk about in a different way, which is what I was explaining under the third argument, where you have the potential for hatred between communities. And there you can talk about reinforcing stereotypes. Yep.
Yep, thank you.
Okay, let's talk about opposition quickly. So on opposition, someone said that we have the right to express ourselves unless it gets violent. Now, there's two things you should note here. Firstly, yes, the government does give people the right to express themselves, the right to say things they want to say, the right to even protest, actually, unless it's violent. And you can explain why this is important, why this is the cornerstone of democracy, that people are able to express their voice, why this is the only way that the government can find out about what people really care about, and what specifically the youth, the student communities care about, and why you can explain why college campuses are probably the best place for these things to happen, because not only are you because they can get a lot of attention to the issue, because the media is always going to report it if there's like a college campus that's getting shut down because of protests, right? So the right to expression and how this can impact the society in good ways is something you can talk about. But you need to note one thing. The government gives you the right to conduct protests. Yes. The government doesn't really give you the right to go into a private area, like go into a university and protest there specifically. So it's a little bit of a tricky issue, right? Because within the university, realistically speaking, the administration have the right to do what they want, which is why the administration has the right to remove protesters from the middle of a classroom if they're blocking a class, or remove protesters from the middle of the lawn of the college if they're blocking that, right? So you need to note that this slight distinction exists. So while you're explaining the right to expression, you need to also say that you need to explain why it's so important rather than just saying the right exists. Does anyone have a question about this?
Yes.
Yep.
So my question is, I'm not sure what was the portion between like private and public universities, but I feel like intuition gives me that most universities are public. So can I say that, given that most universities are public, I think in this debate we should talk. It's more about the context of public university. But I feel like there.
That's not strictly true, right? Most universities are not public, and it also varies from country to country.
Okay, so how should I
you
frame it?
can't quite say that. So the idea was not that public universities can allow protests, private universities can't allow protests. The idea is more that you have a right to protest, and say you have a right probably to protest in the middle of the road. You don't have the right to go into somebody's house and protest, right? Similarly, a university or a classroom specifically is not a place where you realistically have the right to go and protest in the middle of the classroom. The same way you can't go and protest in the middle of someone's house. That was the idea I was trying to explain. Does that make sense?
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so someone then talked about self-defense to voice out your opinion. Yep, this is important. You can explain how, for example, if you were a Palestinian or Israeli student on a US campus and you really cared about what's happening with the war, you should have the right to go out and talk about it. You should have the right to talk about it in the way that gets the most attention, which might be protesting within your college. You right? And so the idea of using self-defense is good, but it's not always easy to call it self-defense specifically. It's a lot easier to say this is an issue you care about and you want to talk about, because not protesting might not always harm you personally. But again, this I think depends on the motion and which type of protest it's talking about and which issue you're protesting about. So you could say that if you're so some issues you can categorize as self-defense, but you can't categorize all issues as self-defense. So the better way to put this is that in some cases, protests might be your only way of self-defense. In other cases, they might not be. So just a distinction you might want to note. Like, for example, if you're say, if you're a Muslim student who is protesting against the CAA, you're not specifically defending yourself against the CAA, but maybe your self-defense here is against the feeling that the government is trying to target people with your religious identity. So that's the way you need to phrase it if you want to say it's a form of self-defense. All right. So the third idea we had here is that it's meant to teach you to stand up for what's right. So here again, we go back into what one of the objectives of a college system is, which is create people who can shape society, right? So you're to encourage people to think about society, to encourage people to care enough about society that they come out and protest, right? To encourage people to take a stand for what they think is right. And then you explain why all of this is so important for a society, right? That the people who are going to vote the next year in the elections actually care about what's happening there, that they care about the issues that people around them are facing as well, because you probably don't just have, like, for example, with the Israel-Palestine protests, there are barely any Israeli or Palestinian students on campus. Most of the students protesting are people from different ethnicities, different religions, but you're forcing them to care about issues that are happening to other people, right? And this is something that you want to probably push as a college. You're forcing them to actually go out and stand up for what is right, right? To take action when they believe in some particular, when they have a certain opinion. So you can explain why this is important, and this affects how they deal with things later in their life, where they care about what's happening to other people as well. So, and also finally, that you can say that this puts into students' heads the idea that you need to actively engage with society and do these things. So, let me just quickly see if I have any more arguments apart from the ones you guys talked about. Okay, so yeah, whoops. Yeah, so we talked about harming other students' ability to learn. We talked about harming the university's reputation and the potential to create discord between groups. We talked about the freedom of expression and opposition, how it encourages discourse, and how it gets attention to the issue at hand. Yeah, so yep, I think you guys identified all the arguments pretty well. You just need to think about how you can analyze them using the frameworks that I explained to you earlier in the class. Do you have any questions about this motion? Or any questions about the whole workshop? Ira, your hand is raised. Do you still have a question?
No, I just raised it by mistake.
All right, no issues. Okay, so I'm just going to leave you guys with some motions to think about and try to use the ideas you learned, like the specific stakeholders you should care about, the objectives the system is meant to fulfill, and the different ways a learning environment is affected. I would encourage you guys to use this framework to think about it, and I'll give you some motions. If there aren't any more questions, over to you, Kamal.
Are there like relevant stock arguments when it comes to education, specifically for principal ones that is not mentioned today?
Usually you wouldn't use a principal argument when you're talking about education, because most of it is about practical outcomes, right? Most of it is about how things affect people.
But would you say like if I mention about, because I feel like principle comes first, right? So if opposition major pushes, let's say, what's that called, like self-defense, and then they run it pretty nice in a pretty neat way, and proposition only focuses on practical arguments and barely try to engage in giving competing principle analysis or break down why the opposition principle about self-defense is not correct, then would you say that
So,
opposition wins?
yes. No. So firstly, principal arguments aren't always better than practical arguments. You can easily explain that, like there's a number of ways to negate this, right? Firstly, you can just rebut the analysis they're giving about self-defense and say that this is not self-defense because you're not being directly harmed or threatened most of the time when you come out to protest. And if you are being harmed or threatened, there are so many ways for you to address this. You can talk to the college administration. If a student feels unsafe, the college administration is going to care about it and do something about it. So it's not necessarily a means of self-defense. Or you could say that, sure, you can protest, but don't disrupt anything in your protests. So you're still you'll still be able to defend yourself. You're just not disrupting other people's lives while you're doing it, right? Or if you would just want to way to generally tackle principal arguments, you can explain why the practical outcomes are more important, right? Sure, maybe someone wants to voice their opinion or defend some particular idea, but it's more important that people don't start hating each other because of protests that are happening. It's more important that people who've really come there to learn and need to get a job at the end of the day are actually getting the chance to do that. So you can explain why all of these things are more important than the vague idea of defending yourself when you have other means of defending yourself.
Yep. So it's still based on the principal metric, right? So if it's not based on the principal metric, then the practical are hard to win over the principal.
Well, no, not really. So what you're doing here is essentially something called weighing, where you're saying certain things are more important than other things. So if you think about it, utilitarianism, which is getting good outcomes, is also a principle. So you can view principal arguments, rather practical arguments from that similar framework. So basically what you're saying is a principle is something you want to fulfill. There are certain things that are more important than getting that outcome. Like basically you go to the question of why do you want to fulfill that principle? Why do you want people to be able to defend themselves? So that they feel safe on the campus or so that they can talk about a certain issue. So you just explain that you probably feel less safe on the campus if there's hatred between student communities. Or you explain that maybe some people want to talk about their opinion, but it's more important that the 90% of people who are going to college to learn are able to get that learning outcome. So you can weigh between different things that are important in this sense by going to what is the principle trying to fulfill. Because there is very rarely a very hard and fast, unbreakable principle that you're going to be able to make an emotion that's about education.
Okay, thank you. Would you also say that in other emotion types, like not necessarily education, but let's say in technology or social movement or philosophy or governance, that I can use practical to weigh over principle by using the utilitarianism metric to have the same basis, which is the
You can.
we have the
Yes.
Same. Okay.
Yes, you can.
Insofar as I can put the practical into a utilitarianism metric, which allows the utilitarianism stuff to compete against the other principle. So
yes, you can do that. Yeah.
So I must turn it into a utilitarianism metric so that there will be a principle. They're all on the principle basis. If I do not turn it into a utilitarianism metric, then it's still a practical one, and therefore it's not fair to weigh against principle, right?
So, I mean, if you're thinking of it in that strict sense, yes, you say that utilitarianism, the principle of making sure that people have best outcomes or society has the best outcomes it can have, and you can then explain why your outcomes are better. You can use that, but that's not the only way, right? Weighing is not the only way to win against that. You can also go back to the idea that the principle is trying to fulfill, like the idea that in this case self-defense was trying to fulfill. You can go back to that idea and just compare that idea instead of even talking about the principle as it stands. Or you can just rebut the principle. Like maybe they just maybe they gave analysis that you can rebut and it's not going to even stand as a strong principle argument.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome. Over to you, Kamal.